6,000 years ago, when much of the world still lived in scattered hamlets or moved endlessly across open plains, something astonishing emerged in the fertile heartlands of Eastern Europe. In the river valleys and rolling grasslands of what is now Ukraine, Moldova, and Romania, a society appeared that seemed to defy the logic of its age. The people we now call the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture built settlements so vast they dwarfed anything else known to humanity at the time, sprawling communities that may have rivaled or even surpassed the earliest cities of the Rhone. Mesopotamia. Picture this. An unbroken cluster of houses stretching far beyond the horizon, a patchwork of rooftops and courtyards covering an area so wide you could walk for hours and still be within the settlement's bounds. Archaeologists estimate that in some of these sites, as many as 46,000 people may have lived together, a scale unheard of for the late Neolithic and Copper Age world. For comparison, the famed Sumerian city of Uruk, often called the world's first great city, would not reach such numbers until centuries later. And yet, these European settlements had already been standing, lived in, and in some cases abandoned before Uruk was even conceived. The Cucuteni-Trypillia people were not just builders of scale, they were artisans of beauty and complexity. Their ceramics, adorned with swirling motifs in red, black, and white, seemed to pulse with life even after millennia underground. They sculpted curvaceous figurines, perhaps fertility symbols, perhaps deities that reveal a refined aesthetic sensibility. Their skill with fire was equally impressive, not only shaping clay but also smelting copper at a time when metal was a rare and precious medium. And yet, amid this artistry, the greatest mystery remains the cities themselves, or rather, the proto-cities, as some scholars call them. Between roughly 4,200 and 3,600 BC, the Cucuteni-Trypillia people built these vast settlements, carefully laid out in concentric rings with open spaces at their centers. The houses were large and well-constructed, often 2 stories high, suggesting both permanence and investment. But why build on such a scale? Some believe these megasites were fortresses, safe havens against the dangerous horse-riding herders of the steppe whose raids might bring fire, theft, and enslavement. Others suggest a subtler danger: internal conflict, rivalry between kin groups, or struggles for dominance over the region's rich black earth. And then there are those who argue that these were never meant to be lived in year-round at all, but rather served as great ceremonial gathering places where far-flung communities came together for rituals, trade, and celebration. Whatever their purpose, they were meticulously organized. Streets and pathways radiated from the center like the spokes of a wheel, while neighborhoods seemed divided into planned segments. There was a logic here, not the chaotic growth of a village swelling haphazardly, but the deliberate order of a society that could envision and execute large-scale designs. And yet, just as suddenly as they appeared, these settlements vanished. Around 3,600 BC, something changed. Entire communities were burned, not the scattered accidental fires of misfortune, but mass burnings, thousands of houses set ablaze in what appears to have been a deliberate, coordinated act. In their ashes, archaeologists find clues, but no consensus. Were these acts of destruction the result of warfare, religious ritual, or a symbolic ending of a cycle before moving on? All that is certain is that for several centuries, these giant settlements stood as the largest concentrations of human life anywhere on Earth. And then, without written records, without monuments in stone, they faded into the soil, leaving behind only pottery shards, charred clay walls, and a riddle that has yet to be solved. This is the story of those forgotten giant cities, the megasites of the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture. A story of human ambition long before the word civilization was ever written, and of a mystery that still whispers from beneath the fields of Eastern Europe. To truly grasp the scale of the Cucuteni-Trypillia phenomenon, One need only stand or at least imagine standing in the middle of Meidnetske. Today, it is nothing more than farmland. Its once bustling streets and courtyards hidden beneath layers of earth. But around 3,900 to 3,650 BC, Meidnetske stretched over 250 hectares, an area so vast it would take you hours to walk from one end to the other. Archaeologists believe it contained perhaps 3 houses. Depending on how many people shared each home, the population could have been anywhere from 30 to an extraordinary 45. If the higher estimate is correct, this would have been the largest settlement on Earth, at the time not just in Europe, but anywhere. Even if we take the lower numbers, only the Sumerian city of Uruk would eventually rival it, and that was still centuries away from its peak. Meidnetske was not alone. Other megasites, Talyanki, Nebelivka, Dobrovody, dotted the landscape, each with its own vast expanse of homes and pathways. What makes these sites even more intriguing is their planning. From above a view we now have, thanks to aerial photography and magnetometer surveys, they appear almost like giant mandalas drawn into the landscape. Houses formed concentric rings around a large open center, sometimes with as many as 10 or more rings. Broad radial streets cut through the rings, meeting at the heart of the settlement. The effect was both functional and symbolic, as if these spaces were designed for more than just living, perhaps for reinforcing a shared identity. Unlike the early cities of Mesopotamia, which were centered around temples and administrative buildings, these European megasites seem to have lacked monumental architecture. No palaces rise from the earth here, no towering ziggurats proclaiming the glory of kings or gods. Instead, every structure appears similar in size, a detail that has led some to describe these as egalitarian cities. But as we will see, that view may be more complicated than it appears. The roots of this society stretch back centuries earlier. In modern Romania, near the village of Cucuteni, archaeologists excavated layers of settlement, revealing a distinct culture, one that blended influences from older Neolithic farming communities with its own innovations. Across the border in Ukraine, near the village of Trypillia, another site revealed a matching cultural pattern. Together, these finds gave the culture its double-barreled name, Cucuteni-Trypillia. These people were masters of clay. Their pottery was more than functional, it was art. Using pigments of red, black, white, and brown, they painted bold spirals, meanders, and geometric designs, often so precise they seem almost machine-made. The vessels were not only for cooking or storage. Many were meant to be displayed, possibly during rituals or feasts. Some were created specifically for burial offerings, linking them to beliefs about death and the afterlife. Their expertise with fire extended beyond pottery. By the later phases of their culture, they had learned to work copper, producing beads, tools, and ornaments that would have been rare and prestigious. The technology to smelt and shape metal was spreading slowly across Europe at this time, and the Cucuteni-Trypillia were among its early adopters. And their artistry did not stop at objects. The walls of their houses, made from timber frames plastered with clay, were sometimes painted, just as their pottery was. Traces of red, white, and black pigments have been found on fragments of plaster, suggesting that daily life unfolded within spaces alive with color. It is not difficult to imagine an entire settlement shimmering in earthy reds and whites under the sunlight, an almost theatrical backdrop for communal life. In Meidnetske, Talyanki, and other megasites, this artistry and planning combined into something unprecedented. These were not haphazard villages grown organically over generations. They were premeditated creations, laid out according to a shared vision. Each concentric ring, each radiating path, was part of a deliberate plan. But who conceived of such plans? And why? Were there leaders directing construction? Or was the design itself part of a collective cultural tradition so deeply ingrained that everyone knew their role? The sheer coordination required from cutting timber and mixing clay to organizing space and ensuring access to food and water suggests a level of social organization beyond what we normally imagine for late Neolithic farmers. And yet, the absence of clear administrative centers leaves us with a tantalizing paradox. A society capable of monumental planning, but without the visible trappings of centralized authority. For now, the soil keeps its secrets. What we do know is that during the age of Maidnetske and its sister settlements, the Cucuteni-Trypillia people were not only building bigger than anyone else on Earth, they were also weaving beauty into the very fabric of their cities. The house was the heart of Cucuteni-Trypillia life, not just a shelter, but a statement of identity, a workshop, and in many ways, a sacred space. Built from timber frames plastered with a thick clay mixture, these structures could be impressive in size, 5 to 8 meters wide, and in some cases up to 30 meters long, often with 2 full stories. Beneath your feet, the floors were clay, sometimes carefully smoothed and even fired before the walls were erected, giving them a hardness and permanence unusual for the time. Inside, the spaces were carefully organized. The hearth, a central fireplace, provided warmth and a place for cooking. Raised platforms along the walls, made from woven frames covered in clay, acted as storage shelves or display areas for the household's prized ceramics. Large clay-lined pits sunk into the floor held grain, flour, or other stores. Loom weights found in many homes tell us weaving was a common domestic activity, while handheld grinding stones or querns suggest daily bread making. In some houses, clay ovens baked that bread, filling the air with the scent of warm grain and smoke. Furniture, where it could be reconstructed from fragments and clay models, hints at a degree of comfort. Low tables and benches, chairs, even couch-like structures for reclining have been identified. In the absence of stone or metal for such items, the Cucuteni-Trypillia built them from wood and clay, shaping their interiors into functional and aesthetic spaces. Archaeologists suspect that each household was more than a nuclear family. It may have included extended kin, with the house serving as the fundamental economic and ritual unit of society. From their earliest days, these communities clustered near the mountain passes of the Carpathians, perhaps to control the movement of people and goods between regions. Over time, however, they expanded outward, their settlements stretching across the valleys of the Nistru-Diester River, the Southern Bug, and beyond. The transition from small hamlets to large, planned mega-sites was gradual, but the trajectory is clear. More people, more land, and increasingly sophisticated organization. Some of the earliest larger sites in the Southern Bug Valley covered 15-20 hectares and housed several hundred people. Soon, others appeared covering 40 hectares or more, laid out in the characteristic ovoid shape concentric rings of houses surrounding an open center. The megasites were, in essence, an amplification of this idea, scaled up to a degree unprecedented in the prehistoric world. But the Cucuteni-Trypillia did not expand into empty land. To the east, the forest steppe and open steppe were home to hunter-gatherers people skilled in fishing, hunting, and foraging, as well as pastoralists who herded sheep and goats. These groups, often associated with the Srednjestog culture, lived in a very different way. Their mobility contrasted with the sedentary farming life of the Cucuteni-Trypillia, but the two worlds inevitably touched. Evidence from burials, pottery styles, and traded goods suggests a complex relationship. The Cucuteni-Trypillia imported flint, minerals, and possibly animal products from their steppe neighbors, while the steppe herders acquired farming goods, ceramics, and perhaps marriage partners in return. Over time, the steppe groups began to keep more livestock, even experimenting with horse domestication after around 4000 BC. But contact was not always peaceful. The steppe was a dangerous frontier. Raids for cattle, women, and portable wealth may have been common, and some scholars have suggested that the rise of megasites was in part a defensive response, a way to concentrate populations where they could protect themselves better. If true, this would imply that as the Cucuteni-Trypillia pushed eastward, the threat from the steppe grew sharper, forcing communities to choose between isolation and joining larger, more defensible settlements. Still, the frontier was also a place of blending. Pottery designs from some Cucuteni-Trypillia sites echo motifs found among steppe cultures, suggesting that even amid tensions, ideas flowed freely. This intermingling may have enriched both sides, but it also set the stage for the cultural transformations that would ultimately reshape the region in the centuries to come. By the time their settlements reached the scale of Maidenetsky and Talyanki, the Cucuteni-Trypillia were living in a patchwork of communities ranging from small, one-hectare hamlets to sprawling proto-cities. Across this landscape, the house remained the essential building block, a place where art, economy, and tradition converged even as the wider world around them began to change. Theories about why the Cucuteni-Trypillia built their megasites often begin with fear of the dangerous world beyond their fields and river valleys. To the east, the vast Pontic steppes stretched like a sea of grass, home to the mobile, horse-taming ancestors of the Indo-European-speaking peoples. Chief among them during this period were the Sredni Stog culture, pastoral herders who ranged with their flocks across immense distances. In the eyes of settled farmers, these steppe riders could be both trading partners and threats. Archaeologists imagine night raids where herders swept into the outskirts of farming territories, seizing cattle, abducting women, and plundering stores of grain or valuable copper tools. Such attacks, if frequent enough, could have driven farming communities to cluster together in vast, defended concentrations where thousands of households could muster a collective defense. The placement of the megasites supports this idea. They often appear on the eastern frontier of Cucuteni-Trypillia territory, closer to the steppe edge. In at least one case, the outer ring of houses was built so closely together that they formed a continuous wall, turning the settlement's perimeter into a defensive barrier. And yet, the relationship with the steppe was not purely hostile. Trade clearly existed. The Sredni Stog mediated goods from the Caucasus and perhaps even further afield into the farming world. Exotic materials, including shells from the Aegean, traveled along these networks, eventually finding their way into Cucuteni-Trypillia settlements. But not all danger came from beyond the horizon. Inside their own territory, the Cucuteni-Trypillia may have been locked in competition with one another. The black earth of Ukraine's forest steppe region was among the most fertile soils in the ancient world. Timber was plentiful, rivers offered transport and fishing, and the landscape could support large herds of livestock. Such wealth inevitably created points of tension. Groups might have fought for control of key valleys or sought to dominate local trade routes. In this light, the megasites could be seen not only as shields against the steppe, but also as power centers within the culture itself, hubs that commanded surrounding smaller settlements, drew in resources, and projected influence across the region. A larger settlement could outcompete its rivals, attracting more inhabitants, more artisans, and more warriors if needed. And yet, for all this speculation about defense and rivalry, not everyone agrees that the megasites were truly fortified in any meaningful sense. Many lack the obvious ditches, ramparts, or palisades found in smaller, more clearly defensive settlements of the same culture. This absence has led some scholars to suggest that their greatest defense may have been their sheer size. The logistical difficulty of attacking and overwhelming a settlement, housing tens of thousands of people, might have been deterrent enough. Others point to the choice of natural defenses. Talyanki, for example, sat atop a bluff with rivers and streams on two sides, creating barriers that would have made an assault costly. Some megasites did have ditches, but these may have been for drainage or marking boundaries rather than strictly for defense. The question, then, is whether these places were born from a need to protect or from a desire to dominate? If they were political centers, how were they governed? Without palaces or temples, the architecture gives few clues. Some have proposed a kind of council system, with representatives from each neighborhood wedge meeting to decide matters for the settlement. Others imagine more hierarchical structures hidden in plain sight, leaders whose houses and privileges were not marked by size, but by the control they exercised over trade, labor, and ceremonial life. Whatever their internal politics, these mega-sites reshaped the social geography of their time. Small villages persisted, but they now existed in the shadow of far larger neighbors. Whether through alliance, rivalry, or coercion, they were bound into regional networks centered on the great, concentric cities of the Cucuteni-Trypillia world, a network that would, in time, face challenges neither walls nor councils could withstand. In the 1960s, when aerial photography first revealed the vast rings and radial streets of the Cucuteni-Trypillia megasites, another mystery began to emerge. Excavations and magnetometer surveys showed something unusual. Nearly every house preserved in the soil had been burned to the ground, and not in scattered patches, as if by accident or isolated attack. Entire settlements were destroyed in a single sweep of fire. This burned house horizon, as archaeologists call it, was not unique to one site or even one culture. Across southeastern Europe in the Neolithic and Copper Age, there is evidence of houses deliberately set alight. But for the Cucuteni-Trypillia, the scale is staggering. To reduce even a single clay-plastered timber house to ash requires enormous amounts of fuel, far more than a casual blaze could consume. When reconstructed houses have been tested experimentally, it takes hours of feeding the flames to bring down the clay-coated walls. In other words, these were not accidental fires. They were acts of intention. Why would anyone burn their own home? Some suggest it was part of a cyclical ritual, perhaps marking the death of a dwelling, just as funerals mark the death of a person. A house might have been seen as a living thing, with its own spirit, and burning it could release that spirit when the structure became old, damaged, or spiritually unclean. In smaller settlements, new homes were sometimes built directly atop the ashes of the old, layering generations of life and death into the ground. But at the megasites, something different happened. Here, it appears that entire cities were set alight at once and then abandoned. No one rebuilt over the ruins. The population, whether thousands or tens of thousands, moved away. Such a coordinated burning could have been a symbolic ending, a grand act of closure for a site whose purpose had been fulfilled. It is this pattern that fuels one of the most provocative theories about the megasites, that they were never intended for permanent habitation at all. Instead, some scholars believe they were seasonal gathering places. In this view, the concentric rings of houses were not occupied year-round, but served as temporary lodgings for people arriving from dozens of smaller villages. Each wedge-shaped segment of the city might belong to a particular community, its residents staying only for part of the year, perhaps during harvest festivals, trade fairs, or ritual ceremonies. The great open space at the center, then, was not an empty commons for everyday life, but a ceremonial arena. Here, dances, feasts, and rites could bind together the scattered farming communities of the region. The radial roads might have been processional routes, guiding participants toward the center in displays of unity and shared identity. On the surface, this interpretation makes sense. The local landscape may not have been able to sustain tens of thousands of people year-round. Fields could be overworked, pastures exhausted. Seasonal gatherings would have reduced pressure on resources while still allowing for large-scale social and political interaction. And yet, there are reasons to doubt this picture. Seasonal settlements would have been vulnerable to raids while largely empty. They also required enormous effort to build and maintain thousands of houses constructed only to stand vacant for much of the year. Could people have afforded to build two homes, one in their village and one in the great gathering place, and to travel between them regularly. There is also the matter of trade. The Cucuteni-Trypillia were not isolated. They imported copper, shells, and other materials from far beyond their own territory. If food and timber could be brought in through these same networks, perhaps even a large permanent population was sustainable. And a full-time population would make sense of the complexity of production in some sites, where specialized buildings hint at organized economic activity. Still, the symbolism of fire cannot be ignored. In prehistoric Europe, fire was more than destruction. It was transformation. To burn a house, a settlement, or an entire city could be an act of purification, renewal, or even offering. Whether the megasites were year-round cities or seasonal capitals, their great burnings were almost certainly meaningful. The last sight of a departing community would have been an entire horizon of flame, the air thick with smoke, the crackle of timber giving way to silence. It was in these moments, perhaps, that the life of a Cucuteni-Trypillia city ended not with neglect or ruin, but with a final blaze bright enough to be remembered for generations. After around 3,300 BC, the rhythm of life across the Cucuteni-Trypillia world began to change. For centuries, their settlements from small riverside hamlets to sprawling megasites had formed a dense network across the fertile valleys of Eastern Europe. Then, without warning in the archaeological record, sites began to empty. Some were abandoned peacefully, others marked by the scorched remains of deliberate burning. Entire regions fell silent. By 2700 BC, the last echoes of the culture were gone. The causes are still debated. Climate change may have played its part. Evidence from pollen records suggests shifts in rainfall and temperature that could have stressed agriculture. The rich black soils that had supported such high population densities might have begun to tire, even with careful crop rotation and manuring. At the same time, trade networks that had once brought copper from the Carpathians and shells from the Aegean may have faltered, perhaps disrupted by unrest or shifting alliances. Pressure from the steppe was also mounting. The Indo-European-speaking cultures of the Pontic-Caspian grasslands, heirs to the Sredni Stog, were entering a period of expansion. With horses increasingly under their control and wheeled vehicles beginning to appear, their mobility and reach grew dramatically. Over the following centuries, these groups would sweep westward into Central Europe, leaving a profound imprint on the genetic, linguistic, and cultural landscape of the continent. The Cucuteni-Trypillia lands lay directly in their path. Inside the megasites themselves, signs of social complexity had begun to emerge before the end. In some, certain neighborhoods specialized in mass pottery production, turning out hundreds of vessels in standardized forms, an early form of industrial-scale craft. Others were tied to flint mining, producing tools in quantities far beyond local need, suggesting a role in long-distance trade. Large buildings within the concentric rings have sometimes been labeled temples because of their painted walls and the figurines found within. But they also contain grinding stones in great numbers, the sort of equipment needed to process food for an entire community, or perhaps for the laborers of an elite household. These details hint that, far from being purely egalitarian, the megasites may have been home to emerging hierarchies. Power may have been exercised not through palatial grandeur, but through the control of production, storage, and ritual space. If so, the megasites were more than just large villages. They were experiments in urban living, each one testing the limits of how many people could live, work, and govern together before something gave way. When collapse came, it left no written testimonies, no carved stelae to explain the fall. What remains are patterns in the soil, layers of ash, and the enduring symmetry of their plans' ghost maps traced by magnetometers thousands of years later. Perhaps the decline was gradual, a slow unraveling as resources stretched thin and alliances broke down. Or perhaps it was sudden, triggered by one or more catastrophes that pushed communities beyond the point of recovery. What is certain is that their legacy reaches beyond the borders of their former territory. The Cucuteni-Trypillia showed that vast, organized settlements could exist long before the rise of the first states and empires. They proved that large-scale cooperation, monumental planning, and economic specialization were possible without the heavy hand of kings or priests towering over their people. In this sense, they stand as an alternative model of early urbanism, one that flickered brightly for centuries and then was gone. Today, their memory survives in fragments, a shard of painted pottery in a museum case, the faint outline of a ringed city on a geophysical survey map, the enigmatic clay figurines whose meanings are forever lost to time. These traces speak of a people who dreamed on a scale unmatched in their world, who imagined communities so large they rivaled the great cities of later ages, yet whose names, languages, and songs have vanished into the deep past. The megasites of the Cucuteni-Trypillia were a bold experiment in human possibility. They rose in the dawn light of European prehistory, burned brightly, sometimes quite literally, and left behind a question that still haunts archaeology. What does it take to bring thousands of people together? And what forces, seen or unseen, can pull them apart?